In this video, the very last in the Art in Conflict series, Dr. Paul Lowe from University Arts London chairs a session with Mikala Tai from Gallery 4A in Sydney and with Kate Warren from Australian National University. Thank you very much for watching these videos. I hope you've enjoyed them, and enjoy this one, the very last.
So we've just got the two presenters, Ervin and Kate. So what we thought we'd do is they'll have their time presentation, we'll have a Q&A just with them, and then at 5:15 we're going through to the gallery for drinks and a talk with Shaun. What we thought is maybe for the last 10 minutes of the hour, we'll just have a more general discussion around some of the themes of the day. So we'll have some time for Q&A with the two presenters. They kind of open that up a little bit more to a more general discussion about some of the themes that we've been talking about and maybe thinking about where we might go forward to putting some of these themes together. So thank you very much. And
I'm just going to do a quick intro.
okay.
Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, so Anthea couldn't be here, so I'm just sort of prefacing what the panel was about. So we kind of put this panel together as a way to think about how different types of organisations can deal with and work with contemporary artists. So I'm representing the university, Mikala is representing sort of small galleries, and Anthea was going to represent the large sort of commemorative museums. So that's kind of what we're the gap, but hopefully I know, we've heard a lot about the memorial, it's very present here already, so hopefully we can fill the gaps a little bit. But Mikala's going to go first and then I'm going to follow her. Hello, I feel really bad that I have missed pretty much the whole day. I had the worst scheduling, but I hate the person that comes in last minute and gives their talk and leaves, so I apologise for being that person. Usually I'm much more engaged. It's been kind of exciting to talk about this project in this kind of setting because we, at our organisation, so I work at 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art. We're a small independent space in Chinatown. We work nationally. We do about 23 exhibitions a year within Australia and about 5 overseas. Our remit is to engage with conversations between Australia and Asia and facilitate understandings and to address misunderstandings. It is a really amazing job, but lots of the work that we've done and what I did not expect going into the role was the incredible amount of work we've done addressing ideas of conflict and on all kinds of scales. So we've done quite a few exhibitions based on this. I've actually worked with Kate to co-curate a show that travelled to Perth as well and then travelled to Singapore in a different format called I Don't Want to Be There When It Happens, looking at Pakistan, contemporary Pakistan, expectations of conflict and the lived experience of it. And through this process I've become more keenly engaged with how we can as curators and how artists, we can support artists to engage with conflicts and histories of conflicts, to tell stories for the contemporary era and to reflect on ideas of what's happening today. We do this in quite a few ways. We collaborate extensively with people like the War Memorial. We've supported Dachi Dung as he has gone and created significant works for him at a really critical point in his career that has almost, I would say, reinvigorated his practice, and those works have just been delivered to the Australian War Memorial. People like Angela Tia, who was supported by the War Memorial to create a huge video work that was shot at Carriage Works that we supported the production of, that has changed her career and is making her one of the most visible contemporary Australian artists. So I think the work that we're doing, or the work that these moments can allow us to tell stories, has been pretty critical. But this show that I'm going to talk about today, I had this lofty idea. I think in my abstract I was going to talk about 3 shows, but that's always impossible. So I've come back down to just talking about one that I did last July at 4A with 2 artists, Jason Fu and John Young. They are very different contemporary artists, both based in Australia. Jason's based in Sydney and John is based in Melbourne. And this show has been sitting, the ideas and the bones of this exhibition have been sitting with 4A for a really, really, really long period of time. So let me see if this works. So the project took the Landing Flat riots of 1860, 1861 that occurred in, this is like the best map I could find of this time, in Young. And it sort of looks at what happened in Young in the mining town of what was called Landing Flats then, and then Currawong, which is was a private farm owned by a really established family who helped shelter people during the riots. The riots were probably one of the most significant unrepresented or not really well known moments in Australian history. It was a racially, huge racial undertones with the Chinese who'd come from Robe, come through all sorts of ways to work in Young on the Barragong golf field, and were very, very successful. And through their success had created quite a lot of animosity on the fields with people. The result of which was extended periods of skirmishes that culminated on the 30th of June 1861, where they were set upon by a huge mob, and we're talking a mob of probably about 3,000 people, who descended upon the Chinese campsite, and in dark, so they were beaten, they were scalped, they trekked about almost 60, or about, if you crows fly, about 23 kilometres, but I think they actually walked almost 60 to the safety of a farm in Currawong with a family that took them in and fed the 1,468 people that arrived for a 3-day period. As per the historical records, nobody died, but there have been significant discoveries of bones in certain areas, but none of it's really been catalogued. And for the Chinese community and for myself, this is a really important story. It's a story that I grew up with. I was never taught it through sort of university systems or through schooling systems, but it was something that was told to us. But it has remained something kind of quite pertinent in the sort of telling of Australian history. As a result of the riots, there was a huge kind of retelling in the newspapers. It's quite fascinating reading how it was responded to at that moment, and within Parliament, New South Wales passed within 2-3 months an immigration policy, and then nationally, the federal government passed the beginnings of the White Australia policy as the direct result of what happened at these riots. So it may seem removed from 2018, 2019, but for the lived experience of Chinese and Asians within Australia, it has had significant repercussions. So the group of us that came together to do this show had been thinking about it for a long period of time. It had been on 4A's books. I would say probably I could find notes about the exhibition going back about 10 years, but it had always been shelved because the right artists couldn't be found to tell the story. And last year, I think the year before, 2017, we really felt that it was the time to do this. And we were extremely lucky in the fact that we received funding from AusCo, project funding, that allowed us to expand the work. But we also worked quite heavily with the local council, Hilltops Council, to develop this work. And that has been probably the biggest learning curve of this show in terms of how art and conflict can work together in a curatorial sense. Their first response to me was that contemporary art has no space, no place in this conversation. The two artists you've chosen are offensive to our community. We want nothing to do with it, which was quite interesting. We've kept the conversation going throughout this period, and they're actually quite supportive now, but it was a really big learning curve for the community of Young, especially because this history, until 1998, when you drove into Young, the sign as you came in said, "Welcome, the home of the White Australia policy." So it is very much embedded within the community. For us going to Young, many people within the Chinese community were like, "Is this really a good idea?" And we were like, no, it's going to be okay. But I must admit that everyone that we met and everyone we worked with has been fantastic, but it required extensive, I would say 18 months of solid community engagement. I went 7 times to Young, so I probably spent about almost 3 months there. I go to the supermarket and I know people now. So it was a really interesting experience. But we worked with Karen Schamberger, who works at National Museum in Canberra, who's a historian, wrote a considerable amount about the Lambing Flat riots in her PhD. She worked with us as an advisor, but also to help the artists who, when I first approached them, were very afraid of the heat of this conversation and the responsibility of telling this story. But we also worked with a significant number of local amateur historians who took us through things, who helped us pull brambles back from an old Chinese cemetery and locate graves, who were significant in fostering our engagement with the community and allowing us to work in the space. And that was really an unexpected gift that we received working on the project. A really huge part of the community that assisted with us was those from the Lambing Flat Folk Museum, which is tiny, but they became custodians about a decade ago of this roll up, no Chinese banner that was produced during the riots. Actually, it was produced about 3 months before the riots, but was used on Sundays after church with a brass band that used to march around the area. And in their very amazing museum, which also has like dentist chairs from 1843 and all this kind of stuff, gramophones, it is their prized possession, but they are also subject to, they really vetted us when we came to look at the object. They have lots of neo-Nazi groups come in wanting to look at the object. It has been used as weaponised for both sides of politics. If you Google the flag, you get a whole raft of conversations about this, which we have discovered in a very terrible way. But it was really interesting to work with them. We really hoped originally that we could borrow this for the show, but they were like, no, it's not possible. And we tried for a while, but they were was unable to happen, but it remained part of the exhibition's sort of heart. But the two artists that were involved, John Young is a really significant artist who was came to Australia in the 60s from Hong Kong. He is extremely supportive. He actually is one of the founders of 4A in 1996. He was a group of artists that felt, in response to the first iteration of Pauline Hanson, that there needed to be a public, safe space to show an Asian Australian identity as an integral part of the landscape. And he remains on our board to this day. He is an incredible mentor. When I lived in Melbourne, he was a real touch point in how we can have this conversation and bringing confidence to artists and creators coming through to discuss this. He's significant in sort of poetry. He has real literary knowledge, amazing postmodern aesthetic. He's worked internationally in Berlin. He's represented everywhere. He's always selling out shows. And he hadn't actually been in a 4A show for a very long time. So it was great to talk to him. And one of the reasons why I felt that he would be great for this particular thing is that he had huge community, very respected within the Asian community. And he does this series of history paintings where he's been looking at moments in Australian history and creating this sort of blackboard series of works that explain, from his perspective, a historical moment. And what has been the most important thing as a curator working with history in this manner outside of sort of the academic sense, when I decided to work more on the industry side, is the fact that artists are very careful in their walk around history, because there is a lot of pressure sometimes for artists to be seized with knowledge, to be able to talk with things, to be able to speak to the future, when actually it is a very personal response to something specific, and there is a fictionalisation that can happen that is part of their own mediation of the subject matter. And John was very careful in how he wanted to do this, and was very integral in us going to Young in the community so many times. Then the opposite artist is Jason Fu, who you may have seen. He tends to make outrageous works. He's currently got a show at Chalk Course, opened last week. This is the work that won the Sulman Prize in 2014. He also does lots of the cartoons for Saturday Paper. He writes quite an extensive lot of poetry, but is sort of a very contemporary Australian version of keeping the sort of traditions of ink and brush alive, but also very humorous. And he and John had started having a kind of bromance in an intergenerational mentorship kind of way. So they kind of chose themselves, and I felt that we couldn't matchmake artists for this show, and the fact that they were already working together supported the idea of them coming together to work extensively. We did share a house for a long period of time to develop this work together. And for Jason, it has been a huge extension of his practice to have to step up from figurative observations to something a bit more serious, and he felt that as a weight, and he actually got a huge amount of creative block for about 4 months, almost paralysed by the responsibility of this exhibition. So I've got a photo here of some of the research that we did. This is Blackguard Gully, which is just out of Young on the way to Currawong. The mining site is just near here where they camped. As you can see, it still looks kind of eerie, like a moonscape. It is unmarked, and you can still find tools on the floor. So it's like they left and no one has ever marked it really or gone back. There's a small now marker that has gone up. But it was even though I'd done so much research, Karen had done all this research, all of us had done this as a creative team, and my assistant Michael, we were not prepared for this experience. And none of us, we are all Chinese background, we are all from 1960s generation onwards of migration. So it is a Chinese story, but it's not our Chinese story, and we're very aware of that within our consultation. But the actual feeling of being in these places was quite visceral, and that had a significant impact on how we approached and researched each site. Check the time. This is also the Karawong site. So we actually, not only were we lucky enough to trace to find the farm that everyone was housed on. So when the Chinese came, almost 1,500 of them, they were put on just across the other side of the river over there on that flat bit. That's where they all camped for the 3 days after the riots in the safety of the Roberts' farm. But the family is a descendant of the family that originally sheltered them, and they gave us unparalleled access to the actual sites. We completed lots of work here. We ended up doing community projects and performances on the actual site, and they allowed us to stay within the old barns for almost 2 weeks to complete some research into what actually happened and trace the steps, especially the movement in that night on the 30th of June. So this was really important for us to go and feel the sort of spaces and get an idea of the locality of everything. The fact that most of it is unmarked and sort of lost within the landscape was really shocking. And working with the community to unpick why that had happened, and working with the council to have a conversation about why this is actually important was very robust. But it was we saw some significant shifts. The amount of community members that would come to our first sort of consultation nights, which were at the Australia pub, went from being 2 people, and our last one before we left had 75 people that came. So the community did come and were very active in feeding into it. They actually ended up doing all the catering, all the performances, and being really involved. But the farm and the legacy of that farm is quite amazing. We decided in the end, before bringing the show back to 4A and in the city, we wanted to actually begin the artistic process with some public outcomes on site with the community. And so the Chinese Garden, which is in Harden, just outside of Young, we sort of lit and did a ceremonial piece. The Chinese cemetery has only just been discovered behind these brambles. They just didn't realise that people had been buried there for quite some time. It's actually really close to the actual cemetery. It just was separated by a dirt track, and no one ever looked underneath these bushes. So this is a new area that the council's actually spent some money doing up, so we could be part of the first sort of official moments where John and Jason led people through a more contemporary version of acknowledgement to ancestors. And here's John, this is us riding out on our utes. Poor Brad Roberts, the descendant of James Roberts on the farm, he was our tireless ute driver around everywhere to help find locations for the shoots. But it helped us sort of figure out, when we kept on measuring the primary objectives of this show in terms of how we'd written our funding applications and our overarching missions of 4A against what we were seeing. And it became really clear that this had to have a bigger longevity profile in terms of academic outcomes, in terms of writing, in terms of markers. We became obsessed with leaving some kind of markers in the space. And as part of that, we started conversations with some other funders and received substantial, significant grants afterwards, including one from the Hilltop Council, who are now have commissioned John to make 4 major artwork memorial commissions that will be on each site. And we're creating a book that will go with that will be available in all schools in the region, but also that information centre in town. So when people come for the Cherry Festival, which is Young's biggest moment, they can also learn about the history that went on. So we were really lucky that that relationship did shift significantly, and now the Hilltop Council is really running and seeing this as a really significant way to address this history that they have found previously to be quite difficult for the community. Cool. But also when we left, this is our almost second last trip in November 2017, the show was in June. When we left before Christmas, we were all very entrenched in the horror of the story. As you read more things about it, the idea of the conflict, the very physical violence, the things that we had found in the sort of the leftover mines were really quite confronting, and we all couldn't get past the horror of the whole situation. And then after Christmas, we'd all kind of regrouped, and everyone had kind of shifted away from the horror. I think we just need 2 weeks not talking about it, and really looked into the story of the Roberts family and how Australia really has this twin opportunity at most times. We have a twin response to others or refugees or new people or newness, which is either to be really welcoming or to shut the door, and that we kind of oscillate between these two responses. And both John and Jason independently had come back with work that focused on this idea of benevolence and shelter. So the work shifted to becoming really interesting examinations of how we should be or how we could be. Very optimistic when we'd left, and it was very pessimistic and dystopian. We came back into a new place. And so here's a selection of sort of John's works, the history paintings. They can be read in any which way. They're images that were taken on site. When he was standing on the ute, he took that photo of that tree in the middle there. But he also went through newspaper clippings, so there's moments and there's like the information about the brass band that played during the riot. So it's a really quite a significant piece of work. Jason went, this is John's other work that he did. He made a video of this girl kind of being sculpted in a very kind of contemporary way. John had never done video before. It made me very nervous. He's like, I think I might start doing video. I'm like, what a good idea. But I think Jason, working with someone, it's an intergenerational relationship, I think pushed him to be experimental, and I think it was actually his strongest work in the show. While Jason came back to working again with text and sort of poetry, and he really wanted to make a response to the flag. So while that was roll up, he looked at all the ways the word rolled and Chinese community have supported the Australian culture and the development of contemporary Australia. So from wood making to medicinal and tea to spring rolls, very important, to indentured labour. So he sort of really wanted to reclaim that flag and sort of mirror the aesthetics of that. That was quite an interesting process because it was a bit more formal for him, while he turned our downstairs gallery into this kind of riot of really wanted to play on the brass band. We had a whole day where he created all these ghost figures that everyone could wear, and we did our own procession around Chinatown. But he also made a series of videos of him driving the route that they took on by foot back and forth, which was really interesting. And then, and he also wrote poetry on the wall, which you couldn't really see, so this is just one of them. And again, kind of highlighted his own personal way of sifting through this bigger history. So I went back to Beijing as an adult and without my mother to visit her brothers. They said to me, what you're looking for doesn't exist. And I found that to be really great. My last thing I'm going to say, before I get cut off, is that the response to this show has been really amazing. It was a really supported group, but it did significantly increase our threatening racial violent emails that we get to our Hello inbox as a minority organisation. We are a significant target of the Australia First Party, who send out flyers and have a website against us, as we are apparently anti-Australia, anti-white, only Chinese zone in ghetto in Chinatown, which resulted in us having to change the way we can operate and ensuring that all of our team has incredible amount of safety. But also this week we've had a whole raft of, we get emails about the show probably 4 or 5 a week from usually, I would say, very right-wing white supremacist groups. And this week we actually started to get quite a few from Chinese community who felt that we hadn't gone hard enough and they called us chicken-hearted, which I quite enjoyed. So I think that really also meant that we were doing our job, that it was exciting sort of conversation, but that there's a lot to be done within how we can help contemporary artists can really allow access to conflicts that may seem very far away. So thank you. Might need someone to Thanks everyone. Lucky last, so I'm talking about art and research, but I'm going to doesn't seem to be moving on. Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. All right. I'm going to start by discussing a work by Melbourne-based artist Tom Nicholson. In the introduction to a recent monograph, Amelia Barragan and Helen Hughes write that Nicholson's practice, quote, is firmly rooted in post-conceptual drawing, buttressed by his interest and skill in archival research, quote. Through his work, Nicholson engages with multiple contested histories, sketching real and imagined interconnections between various localities across Australia, East Timor, Palestine, Israel, France, Germany, Greece and Indonesia. His work approaches such contested histories, traumas and memories of conflict by often adopting a speculative mode, proposing potential unrealised or fictional modes of commemoration or memorialisation. The work here, from 2012, is called Comparative Monument to Palestine. Former head of art at the Australian War Memorial, Ryan Johnston, who is here, I'm quoting, describes it recently, quote, as one of the first major attempts by an Australian artist to rethink how we publicly remember World War I in the context of its centenary, end quote. This is an ephemeral and participatory installation work, whose main physical manifestation is as a series of 50 by 50 centimetre offset printed posters. In the gallery, Nicholson installs these posters on the ground in stacks of 1,000 copies, which viewers are free to take from. The posters document, photographically, a series of World War I memorials that the artist found in and around Melbourne, which each bear the name Palestine. As the artist writes, quote, these monuments, scattered all over Australia, commemorate the presence of Australian troops in Palestine during World War I, and in particular, Australian involvement in the 1917 British capture of Beersheba, in turn, a critical city in the events of 1948 and the Nakba, end quote. These are the types of memorials that are ubiquitous in Australian towns, cities and suburbs. They were erected increasingly after the end of World War I, often with lists of names of local servicemen and servicewomen who had served in the European conflicts. The motivation for such monuments was important and often therapeutic, recognising those killed while fighting in far-off lands. Often modest in scale, these types of memorials are on the surface unremarkable in their quotidian presence. However, they still contribute to a broader process of inscribing a grand narrative of national pride, national sacrifice and national forgetting. Nicholson's gesture in this work highlights the anachronisms that history can throw up, as well as the relations and connections that the historical record can obscure and forget. The text that's included on the posters documents the artist's research, but it also offers a proposition. It suggests a speculative scenario in which each of these memorials are transported back to Beersheba and installed one next to each other, transformed into a new monument, which Nicholson describes as, quote, both a kind of homecoming and exile for these Australian monumental forms, a way to reanimate these linkages between Australia and Palestine, end quote. Well, I don't know why that went on to that. Oh, it's playing automatically. Stay. Nicholson, I know many of you would know his work, and he's a very prominent, established artist internationally in Australia. My interest with starting with his work today, though, is equally as his work as an educator. Nicholson is Senior Lecturer of Drawing at Monash University. As a teacher, researcher and supervisor of younger or emerging artists, he's one of many contemporary artists working today within tertiary institutions. So my role today in this panel was to discuss the university, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that universities offer as institutions when working with contemporary artists.
I think particularly in light of the broader theme of this symposium, there are very particular things that universities can and can't offer their staff and students. Essentially, these opportunities and challenges coalesce around the fundamental idea of research and the dynamic and shifting relationship between research practices and artistic and creative practices. So I'd firstly just like to situate myself in this field. I am not a creative practitioner. I'm an art historian with a background in cinema studies, and so essentially I research art and creative practice in the traditional way. I have a PhD in art history, and much of the research and writing that I've done has often focused on artists and filmmakers whose work deals with cultural memory, depictions and representations of conflict, both in Australia and internationally. But I also have a background as a curator, meaning much of my curatorial work and writing and scholarly research involves working directly with living artists. Not only do I work with and write about living artists, I also teach them. I'm currently based at the Australian National University in Canberra in art history, but all of my teaching experience has been within the context of teaching art history within an art school. This is the case at ANU and many other Australian universities, where programs of art history and art theory are frequently embedded within the school or department of fine art. So while I do teach students who are studying traditional humanities degrees, and one of my former students is here today actually, I often primarily teach practicing artists. So my paper today is, while not so much draws on my recent work at ANU, which is quite new for me, but rather my experiences at Monash University in Melbourne, where I completed my PhD in 2016, and also talk and draw from some of my colleagues' work there. So I guess teaching art history in this context is one result of historical movements and reforms, particularly in the late 80s and 90s, when independent art schools began to be absorbed into universities in the Australian context. And this has created really quite profound shifts for the way that my type of institution, a research-intensive university, engages with and relies upon contemporary artists. As Brad Buckley and John Conomus write, the intersections of art, culture, technology and dissent are vividly embodied in studio art production and teaching, signifying that art education functions as a discursive irritant in the larger context of the classical modern university, end quote. These institutional rearrangements and changes have shifted prevailing assumptions around the relationship between art and research. And this plays out really prominently in the postgraduate sphere. So the Master of Fine Art, or the MFA, has long been a mainstay of artistic development and training. And James Elkins writes that the development of the MFA as a sort of final qualifying degree was actually, it found its genesis in post-war America. Actually when returning soldiers signed on for many new Masters in Fine Arts degrees. And by the 60s, these MFAs have been sort of standard across the country. Increasingly though, especially in Australia, a practice-based PhD is usurping the MFA and becoming the standard teaching degree, especially for any artist who wants to teach within an art school. Australia and the UK have been particularly strong on this part. They're now PhDs in common and widespread. So as artists are increasingly undertaking research, higher degree research, they're subjecting their practice and creative processes to different forms and different levels of scholarly evaluation. So universities structure these creative PhDs slightly differently, but essentially they're composed of two key parts that artists have to undertake. Firstly, a body of creative work, which is assessed as an exhibition, and secondly, a written exegesis, a short sort of thesis that introduces and contextualises the practice. And the growth of these PhD programs in fine arts has accompanied a broader reconsideration of the nature of research conducted and produced by artists. The key concept here is variously referred to as practice-led or practice-based research. Estelle Barrett and Barbara Bolt propose that, quote, artistic practice be viewed as the production of knowledge or philosophy in action, end quote. They argue that practice-led research is a new type of research in which new knowledge is derived from the making, doing and sensing. Paul Carter's concept of material thinking has been highly influential here as well. For them and others, practice-led research is a new species of research, generative inquiry that draws on subjective, interdisciplinary and emerging methodologies that have the potential to extend the frontiers of research. So, for artists undertaking these practice-led degrees, these types of materialist definitions have been really crucial in a way of conceptualising the nature of their research and their practicalities. From my experience, though, I'd argue strongly that practice-led research, the strongest examples, are equally research-led practice. And this involves not simply quantifying the new knowledge that can be produced through material processes, but rather relies on a reciprocal relationship between creative practice and research. I largely agree with Elkins when he argues that essentially the scholarship in practice-led dissertations needs to be comparative with the scholarship that's produced in the field that people are undertaking. So, what does this have to do with art and visual cultures of war and conflict and political violence, you might be asking? Well, even outside university settings, this is an approach that many contemporary artists are already applying and confronting these challenging topics. So there's a really influential sphere of contemporary practice where artists are actively identifying as researchers in different contexts. And I've just included these examples of Joanna Haji-Thomas and Khalil Jurej as prominent examples of what has been considered a broader historiographic term in contemporary art. But of course, not all artists can or would want to be identified as researchers in the ways that these artists do. And particularly for ones who are working within an university setting. The university setting creates specific limitations and specific opportunities for artists identifying as researchers, which I'll just continue the rest of my paper. And so firstly, the limitations of university institutions. Obviously, universities are large institutions, but unlike ones like the Memorial, university generally cannot or will not facilitate situations of significant risk, like embedding artists in complex situations. Any of you who know, if you want to do research in a university, you need to get ethics clearances and risk aversion, and things like that. And that can be very time-consuming and difficult. Therefore, artists and researching research that is produced by artists in university institutions are often less likely to be drawing from direct experiences of war or conflict. With sometimes curtailed access to primary sources, this inevitably creates constraints and boundaries to artistic research. However, these limitations also offer up possibilities. Academic institutional structures require artists to think critically and laterally about topics of wider cultural significance. They also require institutions to perhaps reconsider their definitions of research, but that's a topic for another day. Often the institutional frameworks or confines of the university results in work cell outputs that reflect their concerns for topics more indirectly, speculatively, or conceptually, and not driven primarily by direct representation or formalism. Universities can also open up creative spaces for cross-disciplinary research and collaborations, giving access to potentially a wide range of scholars, specialised equipment and research clusters and networks for artists. And coming back to Nicholson, I think that in this context his practice is exemplary. His work demonstrates an artist as critical interlocutor with complex histories, and he approaches histories of conflict as both an artist and a researcher. As an artist, though, he's not primarily interested in direct depiction of war or violence. Though neither as a researcher does he present his findings in a traditional or academic manner. Rather, his approach opens up ways for both strands of practice and research to be presented and interrogated together in expanded settings. This can be seen actually as a highly contemporary model for creative academic research practices. Nicholson's approach here, for example, reveals the wider cultural practices of memorialisation and how they are often tied up with imagining possible futures. Just as much as memorials are as much about commemorating or marking the past. Equally, I believe that good research needs to be open to speculative approaches, open to future possibilities, and attuned to the ripple effects of research. I believe that this is where artistic research can be particularly potent, or as Johnston argues, our historians might learn something from our artists when it comes to the practice of public memory. I would extend this to the position of art that artists occupy in research universities. Unlike traditional programs and structures of PhD research, such as in the science or medicine, PhD research in the humanities and creative arts is invariably more solitary and self-contained. Supervisors do not directly transmit knowledge in the same way as in, say, a laboratory setting, and they generally can't involve their students in a specific or defined research project. There are various reasons for this. But at the PhD level, artists and supervisors do not even necessarily teach formal techniques of artistic production. Rather, artists as supervisors, artists as teachers, their vital role in this context lies in providing methodological models and conceptual frameworks. Nicholson might be senior lecturer of drawing, for example. However, his students that have gone on to influence him work very much across media. And for this reason, I might skip here, and I want to finish with actually a couple of students of Tom Nicholson. Because I think that one of the things that, for me, is most interesting working in this sphere is the idea that you can trace the conceptual influences of artists as teachers and research supervisors, which for me is a particularly generative model of art as research. And these might not, often don't form a perfectly continuous line, but they really remain crucial in these kind of lineages, these genealogies that universities kind of create. So I'm going to finish by talking about works by two artists that have either sort of had Tom Nicholson as a supervisor or have been sort of influenced by him. The first one here is Sari Zandaniri. Both of these students have worked at Monash. Sari completed his PhD in fine art at Monash in 2014, and his work explores the biblical frameworks in contemporary imaging of Palestine. Sari is a Palestinian Australian artist. His training is in glass, actually. But like Nicholson, he combines this sort of medium-specific training with archival investigations, and he layers different modes of presentations of practice and research. And in this series here is from one called Unpicking Jerusalem. And Zandaniri has depicted the 19th century neighbourhood in Jerusalem called Mamilla. Bordering the Jaffa Gate in the old city, Mamilla was a location of both unique cultural intersections and tensions. It was the city's new commercial centre in the twilight of the Ottoman period. During the British Mandate, it was home of the multilingual Palestinian broadcasting service, but also the stage for riots between Palestinians and new Jewish immigrants. Today, though, it's a site of extreme gentrification, home of large luxury shopping mall in the style of Los Angeles Rodeo Drive, which is what we see in this image here. However, within the image, there's a second frame where Zananiri has superimposed some of the archival research that he's been doing, a market scene of Palestinian modernity before it was destroyed. He does similar superimpositions across the whole series, combining his practice and his glasswork practice and his archival practice. And I like that visually these superimpositions aren't perfect. They're a little bit awkward. They kind of reflect, I think, the competing claims and sometimes seemingly intractable conflicts. And then printing on glass also introduces further layers of reflection and reversals and visual interference. And then really quickly, finally, the work of Eliza Levi, who's a master's student at Monash University. And I'm just going to finish with this. I'll leave it here. This is this is a current series of Eliza's called Books on a White Background that she has produced. She's a photographer, but she does a lot of work in archives, particularly colonial archives in South Africa and Australia. And this series is a series where she photographs the spines of the books, of the individual books, and focuses on the titles and the very specific sort of embossing and materiality of those books. And she presents them as incredibly uniform grids. And so it really draws her attention to the titles and also the shadows that these books kind of cast. The title, Books on a White Background, is her reference to her own position as a white but interlocutor in these kind of colonial histories. And I just want to finish by saying that even though works like these are, I guess, less overtly speculative compared to someone like Tom Nicholson's work, in a subtle way they're also kind of propositions. The titles themselves sometimes are obscure, sometimes are highly offensive, sometimes they're just kind of seemingly mundane, but they are propositions to make us kind of consider what lies within these archives and how they have been obscured but also continuing on in contemporary culture. And I think even though these works by Zananiri and Levi and Nicholson are very different, for me I'm just going to summarise and finish by saying that for me they sort of generate the kind of creative community and geniality of like-minded researchers and artists that universities can create.
The nature of research and artistic practice, practice as research is something that I have a great deal of interest in. And from experience in my own institution, I know that it's a huge pressure, let's put it in those terms. And I think one of the key problems is that because of the pressure, and the main pressure is get them through, get them finished and finish them on time.
Not just for art students.
Sorry?
Not just for art students.
Across the board, but it's kind of really counterintuitive for a number of creative projects which, as you rightly identify, take time. There's a whole, but there's like a bigger continuation of that story, of course, and it's part of the conversations that we were having earlier, which is funding implications for when these people do finish and when they do go on to have wonderful creative careers, and that's depending on funding models and applying for particular forms of funding. And in this context, the sort of problem continues because not only are these models of funding conducive to particular kinds of research, they're actually quite exclusive from a whole range of things, and we often find ourselves in conversations with students preparing them for this, which, it's, to persevere under these conditions, like I have, they have my, endless sort of respect, because it's really difficult. So thank you. I think your talk was really great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that the difficulties of research and the very real impacts that changes in policy can have. I mean, the one that strikes me the most that I sort of see at play a lot is the point where the government changed where the universities get money when they were enrolling. So universities used to get money upfront for enrolling PhD students, and then that changed, as I think it should. But now universities get the money for PhD students once the student's completed. So that goes to your...
And only if it's on-time completion.
Yes, a timely completion and all that. But I think, so I think that has had a very profound, actually, very real impact on the number of students and the types of students and the types of research that has been involved. And I think the reality is that now universities are being more selective with the type of PhDs that they're accepting. But I think, in a sense, that's actually a good thing, because the reality is that if you are doing a PhD, it's a research degree, and so there has to be an element of research.
I absolutely agree. There's only one problem that I have with that often those kinds of, let's call them new criteria, are often quite exclusionary in terms of gender identity or sort of period of people in life. Because art schools, particularly art schools, my art school, we have demographic of researchers that kind of come to particular projects, and they often just find gates closed. So I mean, I agree. I think it's not just
I agree too.